Imagine that we were hunter gatherers. We look at the sun, and even when it is raining, our body tells us that it's noon time, it's not morning, it's not night. And then there's a signal which passes from the gut to the brain. The brain interprets that the body doesn't have enough energy and it's time to replenish it. So, by means of signals that pass through the nerves and through hormones, the brain then sends a signal down to the body so that the person or we begin to eat. It's noontime, about lunchtime. The very fact that all of you are seated here and have not gravitated to the lunch counter suggests that there is something more than just the biochemical signals which integrate our actions. And that is what we mean by the hedonic action, in which the biological signals can be overcome by means of other sociological factors or the kind of food that is there. So, in other words, eating is not a very simple thing, and it follows the famous saying that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Many of us must have heard this, but the person who made this is Theodosius. And in essence, this principle states that evolutionary thinking illuminates biology. And one of the key ideas is that evolution is an integrative principle of biology. So this applies to the hunger signals, to the satiety signals, the reason why we eat, and that's what I'm trying to provide an overview. The body needs energy. This energy is to reproduce, and the control occurs at various levels. We speak of weight and other aspects, thinking that we should look good or we should live long. That's all beside the point. The main reason why the body acts is so that the species survives and reproduction is possible. To do this, the brain continuously monitors the metabolic status. It adjusts the behavior, the signals to the periphery to ensure that adequate energy supply is available for the body. If the CNS senses there is a shortage of energy or an excess of energy, the brain adjusts the food intake and the physiological functions. In other words, it's not a simple 1 plus 1 is equal to 2 phenomenon. There is a system-wide synchronicity of metabolic processes through a central regulation. And the signals which pass through the gut, through the adipose tissue, which go to the brain, and which in turn regulates the uh, status of the energy, are all tightly interlinked. It occurs at many levels. To frighten you, I can just show you how complex this is, not to try to uh, explain each of these steps, but suggesting that there are so many layers of integration which controls the energy balance. And the messaging between the gut, the adipose tissue, and the brain is one such axis about which I shall try to review. Mhm. There are homeostatic and hedonic pathways. As I said, homeostasis is through the nerves and through the hormones, and hedonic is which can override these signals. And that's the reason why many of us put on weight. The information from the gastrointestinal tract travels via the afferent vagus nerve, and in the brain, There are signals coming from the hormones as well, and the brain integrates the neural and the hormonal signals, and then it passes the message downstream via the vagus nerve for the gastrointestinal tract so that hormones are produced and food is ingested. This is a simplified version of how the gut and the brain communicate. We have the sight, smell, and the environment. The amount of energy that is expended is passed on by the brain. It acts through a variety of tissues, including the adipose tissue and certain other secretions from the gut. Depending on how much food is there, the signal goes back to the brain. And this circuit is completed along with the hedonic pathways. The regulation occurs by a series of interrelated steps. There's a cycling of hunger, satiety, and satiation. We think we know what each of these means, but to put it simply, hunger is the state which promotes the person to eat food. Satiation is the feeling of fullness, and this controls the meal size and the duration of the meal. Finally, satiety is the signal or the postprandial event which ultimately terminates the meal, saying that this is enough and no more, unless, of course, the hedonic pathway kicks in and said one sweet is not enough, let's have one or two more. That's what I said. Hedonic process can overcome homeostatic control. That's the reason why there is so much of obesity. If we just follow what the body tells us, the prevalence of obesity would have been far less. And these hedonic signals come from, among others, social cultural factors. You go to a dinner. In fact, once I remember I went to Ahmedabad for a dinner in a ordinary hotel. I finished, we were asking for a bill. Then that waiter said, "Sir, have one more chapati, please, please." So if he had given two, I may have eaten one. And that's the power of the socio-cultural factors and environment. When you're tense, when you have done something good, playing football will not be as easy or as satisfying as eating a meal outside or taking a sweet. So this overcomes the body's signals indicating that it's time to stop eating. And these meal related hormones are what really matter. Once the food which is taken is broken down into its components, amino acids, monosaccharides, fatty acids, these are detected by the enteroendocrine receptors. The chief hormones are cholecystokinin, GLP-1 or glucagon-like peptide, about which we are speaking so much, and the peptide YY. Simply stated, cholecystokinin is secreted by the eye cells in the proximal small intestine, which senses the food and then it sends the signals. The glucagon-like peptide and the peptide YY are both secreted from the L cells in response to fatty acids and protein byproducts. What's important to bear in mind is that GLP acts at many levels, and the chief action of all these three gut chemicals is to reduce food intake. There's a lot of things. In fact, if we can have an hour just for speaking about each of these. Along with the gut, the receptors for these hormones are also present. And there's something exciting happening on the side door. Anyway, so uh, these signals have receptors in the brain, and therefore not just the biochemistry. They also act on the hedonic system. So it's a very complex system that regulates or determines how much of food we eat. We've spoken of those signals which reduce the food intake. Ghrelin is a hormone that is secreted in the stomach, which stimulates the food intake. It's produced by the XA-like cells in the stomach before a meal and during fasting, telling the body it's time to eat your food. The energy levels are low. It has both peripheral mechanism as well as central mechanism. Peripherally, it decreases the sensitivity of gastric vagal afferents, which reduce the perception of fullness. And centrally, it acts by stimulating the NPY AGRP neurons in the arcuate nucleus, which signals food intake, as well as impacting the hedonic pathways. So it has both a central and a peripheral role by which the intake of food is increased. Adipocytes secrete leptin. We are very familiar about this for many decades. And this induces satiety. We thought that why don't we give some leptin and the problem of obesity goes away. It goes away only in those people who have a mutation of the leptin receptor. And that's a very small percentage. And most of us are leptin resistant. It's not that we don't have enough leptin, but we are resistant to the action of leptin, and that's why it has not been used as a therapeutic option for management of obesity. The circulating levels, they positively correlate with the body fat mass, and when there is a higher concentration of leptin, there is a signal to decrease the food intake and to reduce the resting energy expenditure. This is altered through a complex pathway. It interacts with the long form of leptin receptor to activate the venous activated kinase pathway. Those of you who are into biochemistry can refer to this article from which I've taken the picture. And to summarize, signals come from many areas, from the pancreas, amylin, pancreatic polypeptide, glucagon, as well as insulin. They act on the central, on the hypothalamus, as well as leptin, adiponectin, and other hormones that come from the adipose tissue. These are sensed by the hypothalamus along with other neural signals. And the brain, in turn, sends the signal back into the vagus so that the food intake is regulated. Now, despite so much of fine tuning, why is it that obesity epidemic is upon us? Once you have a system where you have finely tuned mechanisms for increasing food intake, as well as mechanisms for cutting down the food intake, why is it that obesity is so common? It's recognized that there are certain genetic contributors to obesity, but in 20 to 30 years, the genes have not changed so much so that genetic mutations or genetic alterations have not increased the prevalence of obesity. So there must be something else. And what this something else is not really known. There are some postulates which say that the hedonic inputs and overconsumption of food has increased. In other words, we have so much of food and we have so many signals saying that eat, and eat more. When I had been to USA for the first time, I ordered the smallest possible milkshake. And it was the first time in my life I had left the milkshake. So the smallest portion of that was too large for Indians like us. and the portion sizes have increased, then the advertisement has increased, then there's a lot of research on how to make people eat food. So they say that there's research which shows that if you combine fat with sugar, that's really something which tends to stick on, and you tend to go back to it over and over again. So there's a lot more research on how to make food more palatable than we have research on how to cut down on obesity. So all these they act at the hedonic inputs, and overconsumption of palatable energy dense meals has increased markedly. So that is, we are taking more, we are earning more, but we are not spending enough. Whereas the basic homeostasis of satiety controls have remained stable. So just because there's more of food available, more of food is eating, the satiety signals have not changed, so that they'll tell the body, no, no, this is enough, don't eat more. So there's a mismatch between the two of them. And that's one possible reason why the prevalence of obesity is so much. Not saying that this is the only one, but this is one of the hypotheses that have been put forward. So, what does the future hold? Is there any practical application for knowing the relationship between the gut, the hormones that are secreted by the gut, the adipose tissue, and the brain, and the cycle which is fed back? One of the reasons for this is to understand how the different brain patterns correlate with the effectiveness of gut peptides, so that it's possible to give personalized treatment plans for more effective weight management. So once you can understand the subtleties of each of these signals in an individual person, it's possible to deal with that, so that what acts for that person is what we give, rather than taking a blunderbuss approach. But then this doesn't take away the possibility that there is something from the peripheral actions of these that could also act. And finally, to advance treatment mechanisms with drugs that have fewer side effects for clinical use. So, in summary, to make it simple and not any simpler, there is the brain on one side and the gut on the other side. Signals pass in both directions, from the gut to the brain as well as from the brain to the gut. So that the body weight regulation is a very complex phenomenon. And if there is one thing to remember from the 15 or maybe 18 minutes you've spent here, it is that both of them talk with one another. And beside this, there is what is called the hedonic system. They say that in every argument will have two sides, and then there is the truth. So the hedonic system is something like the truth, and that can overlay this. But in fact, there's so much of complexity. I have gone through nearly 25 or 30 articles for this, and each article had 60 to 150 references. So you can imagine you need a 10-day workshop to just learn about the interaction between the gut, the brain, and the hormones. So my attempt is to try to crystallize what I could understand and to share with you. Thank you for your time.